All right, so this is Ecology Lecture number 1. First, we should define ecology. Ecology is the study of living things, their environment, and how they interact. So first, we're going to start off with some vocabulary words and define them. So a habitat is where an organism lives, and it includes all of the biotic and abiotic factors. The biotic factors are the living factors in the environment, so all of the other organisms, and the abiotic factors are the non-living factors in the environment that might affect an organism. So if we were in class, I would be asking you guys to list what are some abiotic factors that might impact an environment, but since this is an online video, I'm just going to go through them for you. This is not a complete list, but this is just a list of some common abiotic factors that would have a big impact on an organism and the ecosystem in general. So first would be light, and that includes the intensity of the light and the duration of the light. So the length of the daylight, so is it short days or long days, and also the intensity, including the angle of the sun. It might include temperature. So not only is it very generally hot or cold in a particular ecosystem, but are the temperatures reasonably constant, or are there seasons? Precipitation, so the amount of water in an ecosystem could affect it, and you can have fresh or salt water, and you might have constant amount of water, like frequent rain, or you might have seasonal rains, like a rainy season or hurricane season, for example. And soil and minerals also are some abiotic factors that can affect living things. So is it sandy soil or silt or clay? And different types of plants grow well in different types of soil. So now we're going to move on to the biotic factors. And this slide shows the levels of organization from the most specific, and it gets general as we go down the list. So a population is all of the individuals of one species within a certain area. So you define the area, like you may say the population of humans in Maryland, or you might say the population of ants in a particular area. And of course, ants is a little bit more general actually, because there's more than one species of ant, but you get my idea. A community is all of the populations of different organisms in a certain area. And the ecosystem includes the community, but also abiotic factors. And then biomes are groups of ecosystems that have the same climate and similar organisms living in them. For example, rainforest biome, or the temperate deciduous forest, which is where we live. And then lastly, the largest vocabulary word in this, it really would be the biosphere, which is the portion of Earth where the living things are. And it's about 20 kilometers thick if you include up into the air and down into the soil. So the biosphere includes biomes, ecosystems, community, and the population. Biomes include ecosystems, community, and the population. The ecosystem includes the communities and populations, and the community includes the population. So we've gone from most specific and narrow and getting more and more general and inclusive as we go down this list. Here are some photographs of some biomes. You probably did a biome project in middle school and probably in 7th grade. We don't really spend a lot of time talking about biomes this year, but you're all familiar with tropical rainforests, prairies, the deciduous forest. This is where we live in Maryland, a desert biome, and of course there are deserts all over the world, and there are tropical rainforests on many different continents. But they have similar ecosystems and similar species. So now we're moving on to types of nutrition in an ecosystem. Autotrophs are organisms that make their own food from inorganic substances, and we refer to them as the producers, not because they produce energy per se, but they put it in a form that other organisms in the ecosystem can use. A common type of autotroph is a photosynthetic autotroph. Sometimes they're referred to as photoautotrophs. These are the ones that you're already very familiar with. For example, plant and algae. And there are also photosynthetic bacteria. We'll get back into that, talk more about that at a later time. But photosynthetic organisms use light energy to make sugar. And they convert solar energy into chemical energy. And the energy is stored in the bonds of glucose, or simple sugars. And it's not really technically stored in the bonds of glucose, but the ability of living things to break bonds and form new bonds means that there's chemical potential energy in sugars, and of course also proteins and fats. The formula for photosynthesis is 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 water molecules. Gives us 1 glucose molecule, C6H12O6, plus 6 O2. And of course, we would need sunlight to do that. Another type of autotroph are the chemosynthetic autotrophs, and they use inorganic compounds for energy, typically like methane or hydrogen sulfide. And they are always bacteria, and they typically live in very extreme environments, in places where there is no light. So photosynthesis really can't work, or wouldn't be possible. So for example, down at the benthic ecosystem, which are the ecosystems at the bottom of the ocean, are these tube worms, and inside the tube worms are bacteria that are chemosynthetic, and the tube worms give them a place to live, and then other organisms in the ecosystem eat the tube worms, and then they have the organic compounds in them. If you've ever seen The Little Mermaid, you may have seen when Ursula the Sea Witch squeezes something and then uses it for lipstick. That was actually a tube worm, or it was supposed to be a tube worm. Of course, it was a cartoon. But chemosynthesis is actually more common than photosynthesis. It's just that we're less familiar with it because we can see plants, and bacteria are microscopic. And not only are they microscopic, but super small, single-celled organisms. Heterotrophs have to eat other organisms to get energy. Hetero means other, trophic means feeding. So they feed off of other organisms. And we refer to all heterotrophs as consumers. And they use cellular respiration to release the energy in the bonds of the sugar and other macromolecules. Those macromolecules are just carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And they don't really, again, like I say, you're not really releasing energy literally stored in the bonds of sugar, but when you can break bonds in order to make other bonds in a molecule called ATP, you can harvest the energy that is stored, that's usually created from photosynthesis. So this is the formula. It may look familiar to the to you. It's very similar to the photosynthesis equation, only it's reversed. So we have 1 molecule of glucose plus 6 oxygen molecules, and energy is released to do work in a cell, and then we have 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water molecules. These are waste products. They're not what we're trying to get when cellular respiration occurs. The whole point of cellular respiration is to get the energy out of our food. So heterotrophs come in 3 different categories. We have herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Herbivores eat plants to get sugar for respiration. Some examples would be a cow grazing on grass and a deer eating leaves. And then there are carnivores who eat meat. And among carnivores, we have predators that kill and eat their prey, like lions. And then we have scavengers, which feed on the flesh of dead animals that they find already dead. Now, a seagull eating a dead salmon would be an example. It's important to remember, though, that pretty much any predator will also scavenge if they find something already dead. So while we typically would consider a lion a predator, if a lion happened upon a dead organism that something else had killed, they would chase away the other predator and eat it as well. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. We, as humans, are examples of omnivores, and somebody always asks, well, what about vegans? And while it's true that there are some people who are vegans and only eat plants and plant products, considering that most humans eat both plant and animal products, humans would be considered omnivores. Bears are other examples of omnivores. They'll eat berries and they'll also eat fish. And a mandrill is also an example of an omnivore. It will eat plants and animals. You can tell that it's going to eat meat by the sharp teeth that it has. The last type of heterotroph is a saprophyte or saprobe. Both of those vocabulary words are kind of interchangeable. Another way to describe these would be our decomposers. Now, if you look at this, you can see that they're a fungus. So you probably knew mushroom was a fungus. You may or may not have known that mold is a fungus. This picture, sometimes it's hard for people to tell what it is, but it is a bagel with mold growing on it. And also bacteria are very common decomposers. They're just decomposers that you can't see, but you can usually smell when there are bacteria around, because you'll probably be familiar when something smells like it's fermenting. And we will do an entire unit on, or half of a unit on fermentation later, at the beginning of second semester. actually, just coming back to decomposers, some of you might wonder about worms. Are worms decomposers? And it really depends who you ask. So you have macro decomposers and micro decomposers. Now the micro decomposers are always mushrooms and fungi and bacteria. Now in the case of something like a worm, worms actually have bacteria living in their gut. And so while the worm makes a very hospitable environment for the bacteria to break things down, without the bacteria living in their gut, they really wouldn't be able to decompose anything. So yes, the warm, moist environment of the worm's gut does, speed up the rate of decomposition, but it's really the bacteria that are able to break proteins all the way down into, past breaking proteins down into their amino acids and into smaller and smaller bits. So the difference between decomposers and any other heterotroph is how small they break molecules down. So if we ate a protein, we would break it down into its building blocks called amino acids, while decomposers can break amino acids down even more into smaller and smaller molecules. So now we're going to talk about food chains. So a food chain is a series of organisms through which food energy is passed. Now if you look at the arrows, you'll see that the arrows always go from the organism that's being eaten to the organism that's eating it in the direction of energy flow. So notice the algae doesn't have any arrow going to it. That is because algae are photosynthetic and they would get energy from the sun, and since the sun is not a living thing, generally the sun is not depicted in a food chain. So both energy and matter move up the food chain, but it's important to distinguish the two. Matter and energy are not the same thing. Matter is anything that has atoms and takes up space, and of course all matter has energy in it, but not all energy has matter in it. And we'll get back a little bit to the differences between matter and energy in an ecosystem in a minute or two. So now I want to talk about energy pyramids. As it turns out, only about 10% of the energy at each trophic level or feeding level can be passed on to the next generation, or not generation, the next level, because 90% of the energy at each level is used by the organism to do work, in other words, to move or run around or to grow, but the rest is lost in the form of heat in the atmosphere. Now you may have learned about the law of conservation of matter and energy. So let's talk about the law of conservation of energy for a minute. So energy is neither created nor destroyed. So when we say that the ecosystem loses energy, we do not mean that the universe loses energy. It's just that the ecosystem loses a usable form of energy. So heat escapes into the atmosphere, but living things can't use heat to do work at the cellular level. Living things need chemistry or chemical energy to do work, so carbohydrates, lipids, or proteins specifically. So the energy isn't lost, but it's lost in a usable form from the ecosystem. So energy pyramids and biomass pyramids often look the same, and I'm going to show you a side-by-side diagram in a minute. But because of the energy lost at each level, the amount of biomass available at each level of the pyramid decreases because only 10% of the energy is available for the tissues at the next level. So for example, if we look at this, if you had 5,000 grams of grain and it was eaten, generally this would be corn, and it's eaten by chickens, you get 500 grams of chicken or eggs. And then if a human ate 500 grams of chicken, it could be converted into 50 grams of human tissue if that organism was growing or going to the gym and lifting weights. So this shows you the biomass pyramid. This shows you the energy pyramid, and they're virtually the same because 5,000 grams of grain has more energy than 500 grams of chicken. So if we said that there were 1,000 calories available at the producer level, then we would have 10% of that at the next level, and then 1% of that at the next level, and 0.1% at the next level. So you certainly could not have more people by biomass than grain because they would starve. Now you might be wondering, well, wouldn't it be more efficient for humans to eat grains than chicken? And absolutely it would be. So if you are a vegetarian or vegan, you're actually being more energy efficient in terms of, the planet's ability to provide food. So certainly it's a better strategy for humans to be vegans or at least vegetarians than to be omnivores, but meat tastes good, so we tend not to do that. So now I want to talk about food webs. So generally, you'll notice that when we look at a food chain, that it shows that each organism eats only one species. But the truth of the matter is there are very few species of organisms that only eat one thing. So in reality, in real life, you have many food chains connected together and you have a food web in an ecosystem. They tend to be very, very complex, and it's hard for scientists to predict how an increase or a decrease in one population might affect all of the others in the population, because think of it sort of as like a spider web, and if you pull on one string, it affects all of the others. But that's really the only reason to ever draw a food web, is to try and make predictions if something happened to one population, an increase or a decrease. So if you look at this, we have algae, which are producers, and then we have some primary consumers and secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. I'm going to go back to the food chain in a minute and talk about those. But generally, here it has the decomposers, and it shows the mussels eating the decomposers. But if this was truly an accurate food web, you would actually show an arrow going from every single organism here back down to the decomposers, because decomposers would decompose any dead material, whether it was plant or animal in nature. Sometimes you'll see food webs without the decomposers because nobody ever worries about the population of decomposers, because there's always plenty. Because they can decompose any material, you never really worry that you're going to run out of decomposers. So sometimes they'll be left out of a food web. So food webs are certainly more realistic or true to life than a food chain. But I'm going to go back to the food chain again because I need to define a few terms. Okay, so here we have our algae. Our algae is our producer. In this case, it's photosynthetic. And you would consider the zooplankton or zooplankton, it depends on who you ask how to pronounce it, but this would be our primary consumer because it is the first consumer in the chain. Our small fish would be our secondary consumer. Our squid would be our tertiary consumer, and our shark would be our quaternary consumer. So again, producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and quaternary consumer. Now, the last thing that I'm going to talk about in this lecture is biomagnification, and some books call it bioaccumulation. But this is the idea that as we move up the food chain and biomass at each level decreases because, of the 10% rule, the idea that 90% of the energy is lost and therefore the biomass decreases at each energy level, the total amount of toxins in the system, if they remain the same, would then increase in concentration at each level. So if there was a chemical like DDT, which was used as an insecticide until it was banned, and that DDT ended up in the water. And then the producers took in some of that DDT. And then the zooplankton consumed the producers. It would get all of the toxins that were in the producers. And the zooplankton then would get eaten by the small fish, and it would get all of the toxins from the previous level. And then, of course, as you get larger fish, it would have all the toxins of the smaller fish. But remember that you have less biomass as you go up the pyramid, but the same amount of toxin, which means that by the time you get to the top of the food chain, including eagles, you end up with really high concentrations of whatever that toxin is. And the reason that's true is because organisms can't break down some toxins, and they actually get stored in the fat tissue of that organism. Now, DDT caused a really big problem with the eagle population. One of the things it did was make them lay eggs that had very, very thin shells. And then, of course, eggs with thin shells tend not to survive and end up breaking, and then you end up with a decrease in the population of the birds. If you've ever heard of shark fin soup, Shark fins are mostly fat tissue, and because sharks are at the top of the food chain, if you eat shark fin soup, there's likely to be large amounts of mercury in it. Mercury is a heavy metal that you definitely want to avoid. It's also found in tuna. You may not be aware that tuna is actually a very large fish and fairly high up in a food chain. Generally, by the time you see tuna, it's chopped up into tiny little pieces in a can, so you don't know that the fish itself is a very large fish. So again, because biomass decreases and the amount of toxins stays the same, it ends up getting more and more concentrated the higher up the food chain you go. So not only is it better for the planet to eat at the bottom of the food chain from an energy perspective, but also from a health perspective in terms of environmental heavy metals and toxins.